Hi, I'm Dave Padilla, former Contra Costa County Bureau Chief for KCBS. Welcome to a forum of candidates running for the 16th District State Assembly seat in the June 5th primary election. This district covers Walnut Creek, Lafayette, San Ramon, Orinda, Diablo Canyon, Moraga, Danville, and Alamo. This forum is sponsored by the Contra Costa Elections Division, the League of Women Voters of Diablo Valley, and the League of Women Voters of West Contra Costa. We're recording these roundtables here in the studio of Contra Costa Television with some crew assistance from the city of Walnut Creek. A state assembly member's responsibilities include decisions that include state taxes, car registrations and licenses, unemployment and minimum wage, transportation and roads, state prisons, fish and wildlife, education funding, veteran services, dam and levee repairs and maintenance, and health care, and of course, the state budget. The candidates are incumbent Assemblywoman Catherine Baker and Rebecca Bauer Cahan. We drew lots before the show to determine the speaking order, so we will begin with Assemblywoman Baker.
Hi.
Thank you for coming here.
Thanks for having me.
Now, if you are reelected, what are going to be your first priorities?
First priorities, always, first of all, is to focus on what most affects the quality of life in our community. And that's why I originally ran to begin with, is to focus on that. And education opportunity, #1 area. Making sure there's pathways to education, not only good funding and support programs and quality education for K through 12, but early childhood education. I served on a preschool board when my kids were in the preschool age, and as well as post-high school education opportunity, making sure that the University of California is accessible to California students and there's plenty of seats there for them and they can afford it. And also making sure there's pathways to other careers like career technical education. We have a workforce that is beginning to age and retire. We don't have enough people coming into those jobs, and so we need to make sure there's educational opportunity. A second area would absolutely be transportation and our ability to get around in the Bay Area. It affects our quality of life. And then the affordability of being in California, both housing and just the cost of living. We want to make sure that we focus on those areas as much as possible. There'll be more, but those are some top priorities.
Okay, Ms. Bauer-Cahan, what do you think? What are you going to be your priorities if you are elected to this office?
So I agree with Assemblywoman Baker that some of the issues that are really we're facing in our district are education and transportation. So those absolutely would be at the top of my list. You know, the local control funding formula has really hit our district hard. We are at the bottom of the state in per pupil funding. And, you know, 3 of the bottom 5 schools in per pupil funding appear in District 16. And so we need to look hard at how our schools are being funded and ensure that our district is getting the fair share of resources so that our students are prepared for the 21st century jobs that they're going to face when they get out of the education system. And like Assemblywoman Baker said, you know, we need to make sure that our students are graduating from college without a mounting debt so that they can't get the housing that they need. And so despite the promise that tuition wouldn't go up this year, it did, and we need to stop that. We also need to make sure that loans are accessible and aren't overly expensive. We shouldn't be privatizing loans for our college students. We should make sure that there's something that they can achieve and pay off as they're in the working world. And then transportation. You know, I don't need to say it's an issue that we face every day in our district. I'm a BART rider and I drive on the freeways, and we need to make sure that people have access to BART, right? We have 5-year waiting lists at the BART parking garages in our district. And, you know, I know how unreliable it is and the safety issues that we face and how overcrowded our BART trains are. So we need to fix those problems and get people into public transit if they can use it, to open up our freeways and make sure people are enjoying the lives that they moved here to live. And then, you know, I'm an environmental attorney. It's something I care deeply about, and so I want to be a leader in the Assembly. I'm making sure that we are at the front lines of protecting our environment in California.
That's a long list.
Yes.
How do you think you might get it done in dealing with the people from the other side of the aisle?
Well, I think it is important that we work together on the priorities that are important. And, you know, most of the issues I talk about, the environment, education, were all issues that even in Washington, were being worked on by bipartisanship just a few years ago. And so we need to make sure that everybody's working on these issues. But it's also important that we have someone at the table to make sure that when the issue of school funding comes up, there's someone from District 16 to say, why are our schools at the bottom? How can we be accepting this little amount of money that won't give our kids the programs they need? And so I think it's important to step up and run and make sure that we have the representation to deliver on these issues and get the resources that we need and ensure we have our fair share.
Assemblywoman, a lot of people don't really have the figures in front of me, but a lot of people are leaving California because they just can't afford to live here, number one, and the housing availability is minimal. How would you address the housing crisis?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's not just that folks are leaving California, it's just they're having a hard time paycheck to paycheck to live here and to find home for their kids. First-time homebuyers having a difficult time affording a home. And so there's no question that we have a housing shortage in California. It takes many bites at the apple. It took us 20 years to get in this situation. It's going to be complex to get out. Some of the areas that I've supported, all on a bipartisan basis, are the ones I think are the most effective and get the job done. The first is we need regulatory reform to make it easier to build more houses. We need to make it easier for people to save to purchase their first-time home payment. And then we need to make it easier to control our local input on what happens. So in the regulatory reform, there's a lot of state rules that make it unnecessarily more difficult and expensive to build new housing. We need to reform that. Secondly, on making sure that folks can afford to purchase a home. 70% of people who are renters right now who want to purchase a home can't afford the down payment, and they cite that as the #1 reason why. So I co-authored legislation to make sure that we have first-time homebuyer savings account, similar to a 529 savings account, where folks get the advantage of plunking away some dollars of their own to have it easier to save for that first-time down payment. That allows people to have some equity they can build up and get going. Very proud to have new bipartisan authors from both sides of the aisle for that legislation, and it's moving along. And then finally, we need to protect our local input in the process. Just having the state tell us this is what you have to do without local input, how the buildings look, how dense they are, what parking requirements go with them, is not the right approach to take. And I think it's important also, I've been pleased to support funding. We want to have funding for our veterans housing. I supported $1 billion in veterans housing. They are particularly affected by the shortage of housing in California. So it's a combination of efforts, all of which are necessary, all of which need to work together. Again, the regulatory reform, making sure it's easier for people to save, make sure that we're having some funding like the housing bond that I supported that'll be on the ballot this year, and then making sure that local control is reflected and respected in our community.
Do you think there's an appetite in Sacramento to do that, to change this?
Well, it's interesting that you say that. I think there's definitely an appetite if we're working together on bipartisan solutions. The measures that have failed and either have been vetoed by the governor, have been ineffective, are the ones that tend to be on more party line, rigid votes, and that means there's probably less good policy coming out of it. What's really important, for example, is reforming the California Environmental Quality Act. It's a 44-year-old statute that has the right purpose, making sure that we have an effect on the environment and we mitigate for it. But it's heavily abused in litigation. It makes every house cost more expensive than it has to. That can get done, but you've got to have people who are independent from political pressures and interest groups that like the status quo. And that's what I'm all about, is making sure that we do good policy instead of the politics.
Ms. Bauer-Cahan, housing crisis too big of an obstacle to overcome, or how do you see it?
No, I mean, it's a real crisis, and all of us know that. For every 7 jobs we're creating in the Bay Area, we're creating 1 unit of housing. So it's an economic problem, right? We don't have space to house the workers that we need in the Bay Area. And so we have to face it. I mean, just this year, we lost almost 30% of our teachers at our local schools because they can't afford to live in our communities. And this is something that's real, and we need to fix it. And the answer is more housing, right? We have to have a larger housing stock so it's more affordable and everybody can live here. But, it is important that the bill that was just killed in in committee that would have taken local control away and just said, build these high-rise buildings is not the answer. One size does not fit all. You can't ask a community that doesn't have a fire truck that reaches the 8th story to build an 8-story building, right? And that's what we need to make sure our infrastructure on the city level matches what we're building. We see overcrowding in schools because of overdevelopment. So our schools need to be prepared to handle the increased population that this housing meets. So it's important to keep that local control, but also, do the things it takes to get more housing built. Our county just did a great measure to allow people to build secondary units on their property to make it easier to increase our housing stock in a way that fits in with our communities. And it's loosening up regulations like that really will make a difference. We have to look at what's happening, how can we work with our cities and our communities to get more housing, but do it in a way that works.
California has a big brain trust, and I'm just wondering whether if there's other places, other states we can learn from to kind of get, kind of get their ideas to apply them here in our state.
And that's a great question, and it's something we should be thinking about all the time. I think we talk about the education funding crisis. It's a great example of where we aren't doing things other states are doing. And so how do we bring the revenue to our schools that we need? And there are answers elsewhere, right? We don't have to recreate the wheel, and we shouldn't. And that's a great way to get good policy. I think the Affordable Care Act was a great example of Massachusetts leading the way, and then us having a system to follow. And so that should be true in everything we look at: is how do we use models that are there, but also how do we be creative and be leaders. And we've seen on the environmental front that California's been the leader, right? And we've been out there in front of not only the other states in this country, but also the world, and we should continue to be. So where there are answers elsewhere, we should look to them, but we should also continue to try to be a leader.
Assemblymember Baker, of course, we all know that marijuana is legal here in California, and one of the big questions that comes up is, how is California going to spend the revenue generated by the sale of legal marijuana here in California?
Yeah, well, we should ask that question: how is California spending the dollars that comes at every stage, wherever they come from? It needs to be, how can we best spend them and make sure that we're not continually increasing taxes when we go on a spending spree? So with marijuana in particular, it's going to be interesting to see what the actual promise of revenue is going to be. First and foremost, we need to make sure that our law enforcement has the support they need to deal with the changes in the rules about who can drive under the influence of any kind of substance. There isn't the same type of clear rules that we have with alcohol, blood level, when it comes to marijuana. And our law enforcement's in a difficult position right now of trying to find out how do we best keep people safe on roads. Same thing with employers. There are people operating heavy machinery, and how do we make sure that we have workplace standards so that we're making sure people are safe as recreational marijuana is more out there. So that's probably going to be the number one thing, is don't go on a spending spree with those dollars. Most importantly, we have way too much debt and way too many needs with our current programs to do that. And secondly, make sure that we're supporting our law enforcement we can be keeping safe our public safety. There's also going to need to be many measures to make sure that we're keeping marijuana products out of the hands of kids. The marijuana edibles that look like a gummy bear or a brownie or whatever it is. We are in a bit of a scary place. I have young children, and I've talked to them about drugs, whether it's opioid and prescription drugs or things that are illegal in California, but there's going to have a lot of things pushed in front of them and marketed to them, and we need to make sure that we are spending the dollars wisely to keep that out of their hands. Those would be the top priorities that I would put into it, but it's very, very tempting when there's new sources of revenue coming to the state for the legislature to go on a spending spree, and we have way too many unfunded pension liability, school funding needs, infrastructure needs to do that. So I hope that won't be the case. I've been a voice for restrained spending and accountable government. I'll keep doing that.
Ms. Bauer-Cahan, have we put the cart before the horse on the issue of marijuana?
I think that what I'm concerned about is, do we have the infrastructure to get the money properly, ensure we're collecting the taxes, and that we're able to spend them? I know that there's been a big discussion about what do we do to collect these taxes when they're operating in all cash right now. And so how do we create, state banking measures that allow us to ensure that we're collecting the taxes properly, we're getting the money that we should out of this, and that there is responsible business happening by the marijuana sellers. And so I think, again, it's important that we have proper oversight and we create the systems to allow for that, so we have the money to spend, because it is a new source of revenue that can go to support the programs that we have. And I am absolutely somebody who believes in fiscal responsibility and fiscal accountability and making sure that we oversee our spending, but when we have this exciting new source of revenue, that we look to the future and what do we need and where are our needs. And again, I'm a big proponent of ensuring that we continue to fund our schools, and I think this is an opportunity, but we have to do it in a way that makes sense. I was driving yesterday and somebody next to me was smoking out the window openly on Highway 24, and that scares me. I had my kids in the car, right? And so we do need to make sure that we're overseeing this and making sure we're doing it in a responsible way, so that we are living in safe communities despite these new laws that we see before us.
I want to change gears just a little bit on Senate Bill 10, the bail reform bill. A lot of people who are being incarcerated right now can't get out of jail because they can't afford the bond to get out. What is your view on that, and how do you see that going?
So I support it because I think that, bail reform makes us safer. Currently, the people who are sitting in jail are not the ones who are most dangerous necessarily, because that's not the question we're asking. It's the people who can afford to pay to get out. And that isn't the question we should be asking. The question we should be asking is, which of you are a danger to our community? And if you're a danger to our community, you need to be behind bars. But if you're not a danger and it's just a question of your ability to pay, then we shouldn't be keeping you in jail for years waiting for a trial, which is currently what's happening with our overcrowding of our courts and the inability for people to get a trial date. And so it's a really important thing to make sure that we keep our communities safe by keeping the people who need to be behind bars, but ensuring that other people who don't are out in their community so they can keep their jobs and keep their roof over their head, and they're not losing those daily needs by sitting behind bars.
Assemblymember, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's important to make sure that it's not only what are we doing to keep people behind bars, but how are we giving the judges the discretion to decide in the courtroom there who are the people who pose the greatest threat. Not just the threat to going out and committing more crimes, but the threat to not showing up for their court appearance to go through the judicial system. And there is some bipartisan measures that I've supported to make sure that we are doing bail reform. One of the things that's very, very important in this effort is to make sure that those who pose the most threat are the ones who are behind bars. And we had a situation this last year where there was a shooter in California who posed a threat to the area, but he was able to post bond. The judge had no discretion to keep that person in the court system in jail while awaiting trial because of the rigid rules we have at our state level. And this is an area that I think we can look to other states. As you asked that question before, there's other states that have found a better balance than California currently have. I hope we will have bail reform. I hope it will be bipartisan this year, and I will be fighting to make sure that it gives the judges the discretion they need to make a smart decision right there in the courtroom to protect us from folks who can do harm.
At the beginning of this interview, we spoke about the housing crisis, and there is a connection between the housing crisis and our small businesses. Mm-hmm. They cannot do business here if they cannot afford to live here.
Right.
What would be some of the things that you would try to work for if reelected to help small businesses thrive and maintain their existence in their local communities?
Yeah, well, it starts with a little bit my background. I'm from a family business background. My Uncle Fred and my dad and grandfather ran our small family business. It was copy machines, and really dates me a little bit, but typewriters, very small. Okay. And my law practice was working with small family businesses to make sure they are doing whatever they can to try to survive in California. And California has made it very, very difficult with every imaginable regulation and rule on them, whether it's rigid wage hour rules, rigid tax policy, and rigid regulations for what they can operate and where. That's one of the reasons I ran for state assembly, is try to ease that. And in the past have been supported by the National Federation of Independent Businesses. These are small family businesses saying, we'd like the policies you're doing in Sacramento, keep it up. I'll give you one example of what's a better policy. It's a bill that I'm co-authoring. It's the flexible work rules. In California, we're one of only 4 states that rigidly insists on inflexible work rules for what hours people can have for their job. This limits the ability of an employer to offer a part-time work experience for someone on hours that work for them, and it limits the ability of new people, particularly moms who want to return to the workforce and continue their career, to get back into the workforce with a flexible work schedule. I've co-authored that legislation again. It's bipartisan legislation to have flexible work rules like that so that our businesses can have the kind of arrangements with their employees that mean success. That's one example. And try to limit lawsuit abuse. You've got 2 lawyers here. We both probably know a little bit about how lawsuits are abused. California is one of the most litigious states, and the people who pay for it are the everyday Californians. It makes everything cost more, makes it really hard for businesses to start. In my practice, I remember there was someone who said, I'd love to start my own business. It was a woman-owned pet business. And she says, I now have to have a line item for this regulation, that regulation, and for having an attorney to begin with. That's what we need to focus on in California, not more rigid rules.
Ms. Bauer-Cahan, your perspective on helping small businesses maintain their existence in local communities?
Yeah, it's really important. You know, in our community, we see our local movie theater just shut down. Our local cafe just shut down. And then you see these businesses sitting empty because they can't afford to do business here. And when I went to the local cafe and I said, one of my favorite places, I drink a lot of coffee. I said, what's going on here? You know, why can't you continue to do business? And she said, well, there were these regulations and we would have had to change the way the shop was built, and I didn't have the money to make that change. And so we're going to shutter our doors. And, you know, I think that, to Assemblymember Baker's point, you know, we have to ensure that we have regulations, that they make sense where they make sense. But when they're making our small businesses shut down and the characters in our community who serve us every day can't continue to do business, we need to we need to have open doors. I plan to have an open door policy so that the members of our community can come and tell me what they're facing, and we can look at those regulations and say, where do they make sense? Does it make sense? You know, I was a regulatory lawyer for a long time. Sometimes there was an intent of a regulation, and it's affecting people in a way that was never intended. So can we look at that and change it so that maybe that was meant for large businesses, and we can change it and have a system that works for everybody and allows those small businesses to stay, because they really add to our communities every day.
At one point, California was considered the top of the line when it came to infrastructure. Our roads were the best, everything was the best. Things are not so good right now. How would you address infrastructure if, in fact, you were elected to the office?
Well, I think to your point, you know, we need to fix infrastructure now, right? It is fiscally responsible to fix it today rather than wait 5 years. It's going to be more expensive, both because the roads are going to continue to deteriorate and because the cost of things increases over time. And so we have to be, you know, doing things to fix our roads and fix our infrastructure now. But we also, you know, I spoke a little bit about transportation, but we need to make sure that we have alternative ways to get around, so that, you know, not only is it our roads that are good and we're doing the work to make sure that we don't have potholes and all the things that we face every day, but that we have alternative means of transportation, which means less people on the road, less wear and tear, and less traffic, which is something that I think all of us would appreciate.
Assemblymember Baker, what do you think?
Well, I'm a member of the Transportation Committee and been working on that for 3 years now. And also, I'm just a resident of the Bay Area. Everyone knows how frustrating transportation challenges can be. First, it looks at, I think the correction is, how did we get where we are? A good part of how we got where we have with crumbling roads is our state government has diverted, for years, billions of dollars that are intended for transportation, road, and transit maintenance out of the general fund and into under expenditures. And I've co-authored legislation to say we have to stop doing that. We have to lock our transportation dollars into transportation-only spending. The recent tax increase, the gas and vehicle tax increase that happened last year, does not do that. Billions of dollars in truck weight fees alone will continue to be diverted away. I think that's the wrong way to go, by going to increases in taxes before making sure you're locking those dollars in. We also need to make sure that we reform Caltrans. Caltrans is an agency that does all the primarily road maintenance, and a lot of the other construction. They operate like they're in the 1950s, and I've got a stack of studies on my desk of how they have redundant jobs, not enough public-private partnerships, and not enough accountability, and how they make every project take longer than it should. We need to reform Caltrans. Again, this is before raising taxes on Californians. And finally, I think it's very important that we look at smarter infrastructure solutions. I oppose high-speed rail, for example. I think it should stop now. Those dollars can be better spent in our school infrastructure, water storage, or smarter transportation projects. And I've co-authored legislation to do that and get it done. And to my colleague's point of view, alternative ways of getting around are very important. We need to make it easier for people to get on BART. In this assembly district, there are 5 parking lots. They're full by 7:30 in the morning, and the wait lists are in the hundreds and some of them in the thousands. I was pleased to get funding for our local parking structures at BART stations to help people get out of their cars who want to take BART and not have to commute. Also successfully had legislation AB 758 to connect the BART and the ACE commuter train system in the Tri-Valley area. These 2 train systems are really close, but they don't connect, and we can get tens of thousands of cars off our roads every day, 580 and 680, if we connect those 2 systems. I authored bipartisan legislation to do that. The governor signed it. And finally, coming out in the next few weeks, we're going to see more testing of autonomous shuttles because of legislation that I co-authored to make it easier for people to get to transit stations without having to drive or find parking. That's what we need to do, not continue to raise taxes without accountability.
In our final minute here, there's a lot of complex issues on the table, and it's going to take a lot of work. Do we have the kind of bipartisan support in Sacramento that we need between Democrats and Republicans to make this happen?
To make legislation happen generally?
To make these improvements happen
that we've talked about.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I think that when we get down to it, you know, as Ms. Baker mentioned, we're both attorneys, and I've spent a lot of years in negotiating rooms. And what's important is sitting down with everybody at the table and talking about what are your interests, right? What do you want to accomplish out of this, and what's important? And as you heard today, you know, we both agree about fiscal responsibility and fiscal accountability, but I want to get things done and deliver them here. And so sitting at the table and having those conversations and coming together is how we're going to accomplish things.
Okay. I think we're going to leave it at that right there because we need to hear from you. And thank you to our candidates for answering some of these really tough and important questions. Each candidate will now have 2 minutes to make a closing statement, and we are going to begin with Rebecca Bauer-Cahan.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am Rebecca Bauer-Cahan, and I'm running to be your Assemblywoman. I've been an attorney of 14 years. I spent my time in private practice, splitting my time between public interest law and environmental regulatory law. I worked with corporations to ensure they had the strongest environmental policies and procedures while at the same time maintaining their bottom line. But I'm also an active member of our community. I've worked with our schools and our school districts to make sure our students have the best education possible. And I'm not a politician. I'm a community member. I am an independent-minded Democrat, and I have strong socially liberal values, but I believe in fiscal responsibility and fiscal accountability. But I'm also someone who likes to get things done. And so when the Trump administration was coming for our values, I knew I couldn't sit on the sidelines. I had to step up. And when the Muslim travel ban came down, I stepped up and I went to the airport and ensured that everyone had representation and that no one was sent back to somewhere they would be persecuted. And now I'm stepping up for our community to ensure that I deliver on the issues that matter to all of us. You know, we've talked about a lot of those here today, but you know, I want to ensure that our schools are getting their fair share of education funding, and we have the programs we need to prepare our students for the 21st century jobs that they're going to face. And I want to deal with those transportation issues and ensure that we can all get parking at BART and that we can get on a system that works for everyone and decrease our traffic so that we are at home with our families or doing the things we love. And I want to protect our children. Gun violence prevention is central to me. I have 3 young children, and I know what it feels like to drop them off at school and have a pit in your stomach. And so I will be with you 100% of the time to ensure our children are safe. And I want to thank CCTV and the League of Women Voters for having us today. I want to thank Dave for this wonderful conversation and Catherine Baker for joining me to talk about the issues that matter to all of the voters. I'd love to continue this conversation. You can find out how to contact me at rebeccaforassembly.com, and I hope I've earned your support.
Assemblywoman Catherine Baker.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave, for the good questions. Thank you to the League of Women Voters and CCTV for having this forum again. And thank you, Rebecca. It's good to get to visit with you and talk about the issues. When I ran first time for State Assembly, I ran with a very particular purpose, and that was to focus on the issues that most affect the quality of life in our community, our education system for my kids, our transportation and how we get to move around, the affordability of our community and the fiscal stability of it, and public safety. But to focus on these issues with a very different approach, and that is putting the interest group politics and the partisan pressures to the side and just focus on what is good policy for our community. And that's exactly what I've done in my short time in the State Assembly. And as you study your ballot this coming election, I invite you to visit my website and see my full vote record, what I've been fighting for and standing for, and to contact me with any questions you have or feedback on policy or issues. I'd be very happy to hear from you and be honored to get to visit with you about it. But I think it's important to understand my opponent and I present 2 very different choices for representing this district. We have some areas of agreement, but some where we're just different. One is, for example, Proposition 13. I strongly support Proposition 13, taxpayer protections against increase after increase after increase of taxes. My opponent has publicly come out in favor of repealing Proposition 13 provisions and increasing taxes. I've also very much opposed high-speed rail project. Want to make sure we have smarter infrastructure investments. My opponent is supportive of high-speed rail, and I think it's important that we do different types of priorities for our transportation. There'll be other areas where we're very similar and some where we're going to be different. Perhaps the most important one is I'm the only candidate in this race with a proven bipartisan independent record, and it's a record. The Sacramento Bee found that I had the most bipartisan record of any state assembly member, and I'm honored to have the endorsement of Democrats, independents, and Republicans on every city council and school board in our district, because that's what I believe needs to be done for our government. I would be very honored to earn your vote for re-election, and I'll work hard every single day to earn it. Thank you.
That concludes our forum of candidates running for Assembly District 16. Once again, the candidates are incumbent Assemblywoman Catherine Baker and challenger Rebecca Bauer-Cahan. For more information on the candidates, visit the website votersedge.org. To visit this broadcast online, go to www.cocovote.us. And that concludes our program. And remember to vote on June 5th.